Yukio Ninagawa would later be known as Ninagawa of the world. A video essay on his complete life and works would not only be of great length, but would frequently and necessarily digress into the varied context of his ambitions, especially given the numerous companies he founded. For this video, I want to discuss 4 key international works of Ninagawa's career: Medea, Macbeth, Oedipus Rex, and Hamlet, 2 ancient Greek dramas, and 2 by Shakespeare, as well as touching on some other important work across his career. Across 6 decades, Ninagawa directed 31 separate plays by Shakespeare and 13 separate plays of ancient Greek drama. In total, Ninagawa produced 104 productions of Shakespeare alone, and over 50 productions of ancient Greek tragedy. But before any of that, firstly, it's necessary to draw an understanding of the world of theatre which Ninagawa was born into and experiencing that would make up his first impressions of the stage. Japan's theatrical culture is extraordinarily diverse. Amongst the traditional performing arts are bunraku, kabuki, no, and kyogen, which all date back almost a millennia and coexist with other Japanese forms of dance and musical theatre. Kabuki originated in 16th century Japan, at the same time that Shakespeare was producing work in London. The predominant architectural feature of kabuki is the flower path, a walkway that leads from the audience to the stage and is used for dramatic entrances and exits. Another prevalent feature of kabuki is the onstage musicians. Flutes, drums dominate, accompanied by a wooden clapper. Kabuki developed 2 core styles: plays about fighters and plays about lovers. In kabuki, all the elements are abstract or artificial in the service of imagination, which Ninagawa always recalled as a source of the theatrical pleasure for his own work. That we are conscious of the artificiality, whilst also giving our imagination and emotion over to its abstract rules. For this reason, kabuki music also doesn't dramatize the action. In that sense, it's not naturalistic, yet the music does at times indicate significant dramatic moments. It serves almost symbolically to indicate a change of weather or define the opposition between contrasting intentions. They serve the imagination rather than provide illustration. There is an entire semiotic language that is highly codified in kabuki, combining costume, gesture, physicality, voice, language, makeup, and more. As scenes of battles and swordplay became necessary, such stylized swordplay, known as takimawari, is slowed dramatically, and a character can be seen to dispatch a whole army of enemies with their sword. This is something which Ninagawa would utilize later to heightened effect. No dramas predate kabuki. No, as we have it today, dates from about the middle of the 14th century, and arose out of its own predecessors of performance. No theatre owes its present form to the genius of one particular man, Ziami Motokiyo. No plays were written partly in prose and partly in verse. The prose portions served much the same purpose as the iambics in ancient Greek theatre. A prose passage often gradually heightens into verse, and the chanting of these portions is neither quite singing, neither are they spoken. A no play is shorter than a kabuki play, and often a play is written around one or a series of poems. In essence, they are dramatic adaptations based on an existing library of material. Sometimes, the classical Japanese theatre of No is discussed in comparison to the ancient Greek drama, as they're both masked musical dramatic performances of song and poetry. For those more familiar with the traditions of Western theatre, this can serve as some useful grounding, but their wide differences are very apparent on inspection. But it will be useful to consider later when we explore how Ninagawa handled the ancient Greek dramas. The differences of stage is immediately obvious. No is generally performed indoors, whereas ancient Greek theatre is in the open air. While the Greek stage is a large ovular or circular space, No has a small stage and a walkway serving as a transition of time. Whilst a portion of ancient Greek theatre didn't yet utilize a skene, in No, there is a permanently painted pine tree on the back wall that symbolizes the ancient holy tree in the former capital city of Nara. In both, settings are implied and distances are evoked. The performance of No demands for stylization. In imitation, there should be an element of the unrealistic. If imitation is pressed too far, it infringes on reality and ceases to give an impression of likeness at all. The No stage is certainly minimal, with the audience investing lots of imagination into the performance, and this can be said of the ancient Greek stage too. However, the Greek stage utilized machinery stage effects, the presence of statues and grave mounds, trolleys wheeling out the dead or dying bodies, and gods appearing from above the skene, ghosts appearing from the ground, that made it far from minimalistic. As for costumes, though the stage is minimal, the costumes of No are very elaborate. This could be said of Greek costumes too, but that ancient Greek costumes tended to be more related to the dramatic or symbolic effect of costume, often layered in meaning that was relevant for that specific play. Aristophanes tells us that Sophocles had his actors appear transformed into birds, and Heracles was wheeled out in a sheet. Aeschylus's Furies shocked the audience with snake hair. Another character appeared returned from the sea covered in seaweed and barnacles. Xerxes appears in tattered rags. This is not so much a realism, but a theatricality of character. Unlike ancient Greek plays, where the chorus and actors wear a mask over their whole head, in No, a mask is generally slightly smaller than the human face. No masks were typically made of wood, whereas ancient Greek masks were typically made of linen, leather, cork, or other lightweight material. The audience invests the performance with their imagination, but props, when needed, are more realistically represented. The cast of characters in No need not be more than 2 people. The Waki, they explain the circumstances of the play, very much like a Euripidean prologue, but unlike Euripides' drama, Waki are always men. The principal actor in No, the Shiite, can be either a male or female. The chorus of No consists of 8 to 12 members, but unlike Greek tragedy, they sit side stage and are not prominently stage center. They never dominate the stage. Unlike the Greek chorus that danced, the No chorus remains seated, nor do they perform an independent chorus in the Greek style. The chorus of No take no part in the action, but speak on behalf of the principal actor, whilst they are miming or engrossly involved in dance. The musical instruments involved in No are the drum, sticks, and flute. And the flutes are only heard at standardized intervals, the start, the climax, and the ending. However, both No and ancient Greek drama are intimately related to religious spaces. So these were the traditions that formed the background to Ninagawa's introduction to theatre. Yukio Ninagawa was born on October 15, 1935, in Kawaguchi City of the Saitama Prefecture of Japan, just north of Tokyo. These images hardly give the impression of the bustling and busy place that it was in his youth. It was Ninagawa's early experiences with kabuki, introduced to him by his mother, that was the seed of his theatrical taste. In the 1930s, like Japan's cinema, kabuki was politically charged, as part of the imperial project. Up to the Second World War, it was a thriving art as new plays were made to support the war effort. After the war, new plays were seldom written, if at all, and so effectively ended its status as a living art. Shingeki, new drama, supplanted kabuki, and became the dominant theatre of the first half of the 20th century. Shingeki referred to a style of theatre that sought to modernize and westernize Japanese drama. Shingeki was a response to the traditional forms of Japanese theatre, such as kabuki and No, which were seen as outdated and stagnant. The Shingeki movement aimed to introduce new, more realistic and more naturalistic forms of drama inspired by Western theatre. The movement also sought to promote a more realistic and psychologically nuanced approach to acting, departing from the stylized and formalized traditions of kabuki and No. These plays often focused on contemporary social issues, such as class struggles, the role of women in society, and the impact of modernization on traditional Japanese values. After graduating from high school in 1955, Ninagawa wanted to be a painter, but failed the entrance exam to the Tokyo University of the Arts. Whilst he was unsure of his future career path, he happened to see a performance of Eibakobo's Seifuku by the Gekidan Seihai, the Young Actors Theatre Company, which was founded 3 years earlier, and was so impressed that he joined the group, where he remained for the best part of a decade. The Seihai was founded by former members of the most notable Shingeki company. At the Seihai, he was drilled into the Stanislavski-inspired techniques. wherein script analysis was integral. Later, Ninagawa would distance himself from these approaches, but they would nevertheless still remain an important aspect of his approach to directing. 2 years later, in 1967, he left the Gekidan Seihai Theatre Company and formed the Modern People's Theatre. He was active as an actor, but realized that he was suited to directing, so he formed a theatre company and turned to directing. When I turned 30 and chose to become a theatre director, I decided to incorporate into my work the traditional performing arts that Shingeki had discarded as old and worthless. Perhaps more precisely, at age 34, he made his directorial debut in 1969 with Toshiro Ishido's The Troubled Gods Do Not Depart. Shimizu, while still a student, wrote plays for the Seihai Company in 1960. In 1968, Ninagawa, while still an actor with the Seihai, asked Shimizu to write a play for him to direct. Shimizu wrote Frivolity Filled with Sincerity for Ninagawa to produce. However, even though Ninagawa wanted to produce the play, the script got rejected. Due to this incident, Ninagawa and some other people who worked with him left the Seihai. Shimizu and Ninagawa set up the Modern People's Theatre and the Modern Men's Theatre. Ninagawa made his debut as a director during the heyday of the underground and small theatre movement. The Japanese directors Yukio Ninagawa and Tadashi Suzuki emerged at a time when theatre practitioners were dissatisfied with Shingeki, but they sought to rejuvenate traditional work with new materials from inside Japan. Ninagawa himself says, "When the Shingeki movement tried to give Japanese body and flesh to Brecht-like theatre, Fukuda was the first to actually do that. Fukuda-san's plays were the first ones in which theatre people at the time succeeded in creating a truly Japanese alienation effect in theatre. In the ensuing small theatre playwrights, Jiro Kara and Tadashi Suzuki went beyond Fukuda-san to a new realm all at once. But if it weren't for Fukuda-san, there would not have been even the foundation from which they could have made their appearance like that. Fukuda-san made theatre that wasn't embarrassing when performed with the Japanese physique and mannerisms. That is how important Fukuda-san's work was and how significant it is historically." Ninagawa's first productions were of kabuki, taking 19th century classical plays into the 1970s with the use of rock music and updated stylization. This predates his directorial engagement with ancient Greek plays or Shakespeare, but already here he'd established his concern and efforts to lift classical work into the contemporary stage. Ninagawa was also influenced in this direction by Yukio Mishima, who had written modern versions of No plays, reimagining them as contemporary dramas, in his work simply titled Modern No Plays. Yukio Mishima was a controversial but prominent Japanese author, playwright, and political activist, known for his modern interpretations of traditional Japanese forms, including No. His series of modern No plays offered a fresh perspective on this ancient art form. He was a man of both variety and contradiction, too vast to explore here. Ninagawa would direct two as a double bill, and their collaboration was a significant moment in Ninagawa's career. Toho was a major player in the Japanese film industry, and by 1974 it had established itself as a cinematic powerhouse. Toho is now synonymous with the Godzilla franchise, creating a cultural phenomenon with its giant monster films. These films were immensely popular both domestically and internationally. Toho had built a strong infrastructure, including production facilities, distribution networks, and talent pools. While Godzilla was their most iconic creation, Kurosawa epitomized the artistic and critical acclaim side of Toho, elevating Toho's reputation as a studio capable of producing world-class cinema. Toho produced a wide range of films, including dramas, comedies, historical epics, and samurai films, such as Kurosawa's Seven Samurai. Succeeding at both commercial and critical films, they formed a powerful combination that propelled Toho to prominence in the Japanese film industry. The studio enjoyed significant commercial success with many of its films and played a crucial role in shaping the Japanese film industry as a whole. By 1974, Toho was a well-established and influential force in the world of cinema, making it a significant opportunity for Yukio Ninagawa when they approached him to direct a production. When the then Toho theatre producer, Tadao Nakane, approached Yukio Ninagawa in 1974 when Ninagawa was 39, they invited him to direct larger-scale stage productions, and this meant they were expanding their operation to include theatre, but they weren't establishing a separate theatre company structure like Ninagawa had done with his various troupes. Toho's primary focus remained on film production, but they saw an opportunity to leverage their brand and resources into theatre by collaborating with a talented director like Ninagawa. The result of this partnership was to work on his first large-scale adaptation of a work by Shakespeare. Ninagawa was to direct a new version of Romeo and Juliet, which he had already experimented with in 1964. So Ninagawa disbanded Sakurasha, the Cherry Blossoms Company, and focused on his new venture. This afforded Ninagawa to visit Italy for research, and on returning from Italy, he advised his actors to watch Federico Fellini films, and incorporated costume not unlike the Zeffirelli film of Romeo and Juliet in 1958. And by using actors trained in kabuki, he was able to bring a different energy compared to the British productions. It featured a cast of 65 and music by Elton John. Many of his contemporaries were appalled. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that Shakespeare was first being brought and referenced in Japan. To translate Shakespeare to Japanese, it was necessary to use the older formal language of kabuki. By the 1880s, Shakespeare's work was increasingly available and popular. Through the 70s, Ninagawa continues with his English and Greek classics with King Lear in 1975 and Oedipus Rex in 1976. For his Sophocles production, Ninagawa used a huge cast of 160 actors. This created the real sense of a community which Oedipus and Jocasta presided over. Despite the restricted cast of no drama, Ninagawa has said, "As I see it, one of the traits of Asianness is multitude, which is why I like to use more than 50 actors on stage." Ninagawa had an extraordinary gift for choreographing large crowds. He considered this element to be in stark contrast with European theatre, which focuses on psychological realism of individual characters. Ninagawa desired to move away from psychological realism and create a visceral world which made sense to his contemporary audience. Admittedly, Ninagawa loved cinema far more than theatre, and whilst he never studied directing, he had learned much from cinema. Akira Kurosawa had also been creating Shakespeare adaptations into the Japanese for Toho by infusing it with Japanese relatable contexts, notably in Throne of Blood, a genius reworking of Macbeth, The Bad Sleep Well, an innovative retelling of Hamlet, and Ran, a masterful adaptation of King Lear. Yet, with this medium being cinema, Kurosawa was tasked with representing his world with realism and literal setting. Nevertheless, he found creative and clever ways to approach this. In Throne of Blood, the unnaturally exaggerated expressions of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are stylized as to evoke no masks. In Kurosawa's Ran, he said that the images of natural phenomena, the sun, the moon, the billowing clouds, were representing the Buddhist deities peering down on humanity with disappointment. Similarly, Ninagawa finds the central themes of the work and uses Japanese context to find ways to emphasize meaning of the material, not necessarily subtracting or adding, but imbuing it with a new and colorful texture. The Toho Company produced several productions of both Shakespeare and ancient Greek drama for Ninagawa. However, it would be Ninagawa's Medea that would bring him to international attention. Ninagawa's next major production was another Greek tragedy, Medea by Euripides. This was to be his most transgressive and avant-garde work to date. What's more, it was the first production of Ninagawa's to be seen abroad, wherein he showed foreign audiences that he would take what was to him a foreign work and make a Japanese theatre work, yet it was adhering to the faithfulness of the production. The continuation of utilizing the codified all-male troupe of kabuki fit with the all-male tradition of ancient Greek theatre. The production was scattered with manipulated kabuki references. Ninagawa also subverted gender codification by utilizing kabuki poses codified for men for his Medea. Ninagawa has his chorus perform a specific kabuki convention in reverse. Ordinarily, young women would put red ribbon in their mouth to signify love. Instead, Ninagawa has them pulling red ribbon out of their mouths in a now iconic presentation. Also, wherein kabuki has the shedding of outer layers of costume to reveal inner character, Ninagawa incorporates this into Medea's arc. As Medea releases herself from her history and roles of wife and mother, becoming herself as woman, She removes her outer layers of clothing and headdress, revealing her essential self, yet ready to enact revenge on her husband and murder of her children. In the first choral ode, the chorus sing, "Holy rivers flow back to their source, reversed is the order of things." The music also utilizes a more rustic and rough version of an instrument associated with kabuki, the shamisen. But the production also featured Western music by Handel and Barber, whilst the play opens with a contemporary pop song. There was also a link between Japanese mythical history and the play. The play ends with Medea rescued by Helios, the Greek god of the sun, who is Medea's grandfather. Japanese mythical origin was traced back to the goddess of the sun, Amaterasu. Haru Yamagata, who translated everything Greek tragedy for Ninagawa after 2002, described the history of Greek tragic performances in Japan. The oldest recorded performance of Greek tragedy in Japan was an adaptation performed by the Kawakami Otojiro Theatre Company in 1894, but the first real performances didn't begin until 1958, with the productions resulting from the activities of the Greek Tragedy Study Group, started by students of the Department of Aesthetics of Tokyo University. Now Ninagawa seems to be mounting productions of the Greek tragedies rather regularly, but before this, there were very few performances of Greek tragedy in Japan, and there were also the performances of Greek tragedies that Tadashi Suzuki became famous for with his theatre company. Medea would also be Ninagawa's first production overseas. A movie of the stage production of Euripides' Medea, which was performed in Athens, Greece in 1983, was made by the Toho Company. The production would be performed well over 250 times across 15 revivals between its premiere in 1978 and 1999. In 1978, Ninagawa would also direct his first production of Hamlet. Ninagawa would go on to direct 8 different versions of Hamlet throughout his career, never feeling fully satisfied or finished with it. In these variations, he used different age actors, different sets and plane spaces, different time periods and different translations, but I'll focus on one of these productions later in the video. In 1980, Ninagawa directed probably his most internationally famous work, Ninagawa Macbeth, a title distinguishing it from his 2001 Macbeth. Ninagawa Macbeth is in the Azuchi Momoyama period, at Azuchi Castle, a period of intense political instability, but also a period which was chronologically equivalent to the time of Shakespeare's life. The play Macbeth itself was first performed 6 years after the traditional end date of the Azuchi Momoyama period. Ninagawa wanted this to be a vision of Japan's ancestors. Everyone in the play is already dead. The entire production has an elegiac feeling. The elegiac effect was conscious of repressive politics and resonant to those lives lost. Yet Ninagawa accomplishes this synthesis of his Japanese production of a Western drama through remaining conscious of a theatrical play being artificial. This was a performance taking place almost like an ephemeral vision. Most Japanese audiences recall this version of Macbeth as Ninagawa's Butsudan Macbeth. A butsudan is a shrine or altar, commonly found in Japanese homes and temples. Its appearance is like a cabinet with religious icons enclosed. The primary function of a butsudan is to pay respect to family members that have passed and to the Buddha. Ninagawa reflected on his Macbeth production by saying, "For my Macbeth, I placed it on a portable altar. According to Buddhism, the souls of the dead, the souls of your ancestors, are placed in a box inside that altar." The story of Macbeth developed from Japanese feelings towards ancestry. I have a dialogue and approach Shakespeare in that way. When I did this in Japan, everyone said I was crazy. At the opening of Ninagawa's Butsudan Macbeth, 2 elderly women, kabuki actors in white face paint, enter the stage, opening the doors of a greatly oversized butsudan. And then they take their seats on either side of the stage. Throughout the play, they observe the action, they eat, drink tea, they weep, and eventually close the butsudan doors again at the end of the performance. They remain visible throughout the performance as active witnesses to the story of the play. This butsudan idea, the monumental metaphor of the family altar, provided a very clear lens through which Ninagawa could examine and refract Shakespeare's play. They acted as a link between the costume drama that unfolded inside the butsudan and the audience's contemporary reality. Effectively, they were serving a similar function as an ancient Greek chorus, without the verbal commentary, song, and dance. but by providing observation and reactions constantly present throughout the performance, they were providing an objective view of the character's own subjective experiences. Ninagawa's Butsudan Macbeth featured cherry blossoms falling onto the stage. The scene in the play between Malcolm and Macduff is set in a castle filled with gigantic bronze statuary. Banquo's murder, normally played in gloom, here takes place against a background of cascading cherry blossoms, which becomes one of the production's visual motifs. In this Ninagawa Macbeth, cherry blossoms would have a special meaning. Cherry blossoms symbolize transience, the ephemeral nature of life. Within this, cherry blossoms are related to death, in particular the dying young, especially those by suicide. When cherry blossoms fall in Ninagawa's production, it is at precise moments when Macbeth is realizing his ambition, foreshadowing to the audience the impermanence and futility of his ambition. They were a perfect metaphor of his rise to power. In many ways, the theme of futility of permanence and ambitions of power are strikingly more sharply delivered under such rich and meaningful visual motifs that are deeply tied to a culture's traditional worldview. Mono no Aware doesn't have a direct equivalent in English to describe that sensation of sentimentality, melancholy, acceptance, and futility experienced simultaneously. It's not exactly an existential disposition, because it's far too agreeable with life's nature to be described as such. In essence, to understand that disposition is to understand deep themes of the play. The stimulation of the choice of spectacle of cherry blossoms directly encourages the audience to hold that particular disposition, which cannot be directly translated linguistically, to contemplate both mortality and ambitions of power. Ninagawa used falling objects such as cherry blossoms or sand or rocks throughout productions of his career as a means of activating visual space and allowing the audience to remain present in the immediacy of the theatre. Ninagawa adds complexity to Lady Macbeth, which even Kurosawa might have left more one-dimensionally. Here Ninagawa has Lady Macbeth playing the cello and presents her as a person of sensitivity and grace, which is corrupted and destroyed by her own desires for ambitions. This subverts the Lady Macbeth that is so often one-dimensionally manipulative, which often leaves the audience wondering how Macbeth, whose character is full of such rage and ambition, would love such a person. The British theatre critic Michael Billington, who greatly admired the production, referred to its lead lord and lady as, if not fallen angels, then ruined titans. What's more, Ninagawa transferred the play from a Catholic metaphysical view to an earthly Buddhist play, as the religious observer of the actions. It must be also noted that Shakespeare was writing at the height of the Renaissance, when a deep study of the Roman classical writers was as much a norm as the study of the Bible, and it has often been debated what Shakespeare's religion truly was, debated from a modern perspective that perhaps forgets the culture and religion are often fused in a significant cultural epoch. While Shakespeare's works have an undoubtedly Catholic cosmological spirituality, meanwhile, there is indeed a kind of Roman Stoicism within the disposition of his characters and the work they inhabit. Such Roman Stoicism isn't so incompatible with traditional Japanese cultural attitudes. Consider the key philosophical attitudes of ancient Rome. Each of Stoicism, Epicureanism, and Humanism have many crossovers with Buddhism. Therefore, I think Shakespeare is adeptly handled in the Japanese compared to the Protestant modern West. Ninagawa wrote that his entire approach to Ninagawa Macbeth was the existential speech in Act 5, Scene 5, as Macbeth describes life as brief and full of meaningless ambition. Nevertheless, his warrior spirit compels him to die fighting. Ninagawa Macbeth became so famous in England in 1985 that it was the seed for many of the British theatre-going public to their enthusiasm towards Ninagawa's plays. Significantly, however, in 1984, Yukio Ninagawa found Geikisha Ninagawa Studio in Tokyo as a place for experimental workshop during the rehearsals for the original production of Tango at the End of Winter in a refurbished studio called Benison Pit. Its first official production was a staging of Chekhov's Three Sisters, billed as to be staged in the rehearsal studio, an all-exposed space, with even the factory doors showing the town outside. As an experimental studio, Geikisha Ninagawa Studio would utilize this to explore experimental stages, and the visual style of his work evolved from before and after the founding of this studio. Ninagawa staged another Macbeth in 2001, very different from this 1980s version. Whilst the early 1980 version was an unmistakably Buddhist interpretation, the 2001 version was less specifically religious, and much of the visual subtext was removed. Instead of the butsudan, sliding mirrors opened the play, and cherry blossoms were replaced with oversized lotus leaves and a much more modern setting. The decayed lotus leaves symbolize political corruption and uncertainty. The music of Brahms was replaced with dead cadence. Overall, the response was less enthusiastic compared to the impact of the predecessor, but one wonders if this says something more about the audiences rather than the production. That staging it in the empty stage, removed from the fetishism for the exotic, made it less appealing to the vicarious audiences outside of Asia. Ninagawa's 1987 production for Shakespeare's The Tempest was set on Japan's northwest island of Sado. Ninagawa even spent some time on Sado Island, but found nothing very inspiring about the literal place of an island as a setting in itself. Instead, Sado Island has a more important meaning in Japan. It is the location where Zeami, the master of no drama, was banished from Kyoto to Sado Island in 1434, and was said to have died there around 1444. Drawing parallels between Prospero and Zeami, the founder of no theatre, Ninagawa was bringing two master writers of their forms together, Zeami and Shakespeare. As with his 1980 Macbeth, Ninagawa used a frame within a frame, in which The Tempest was a company rehearsal. The version was subtitled, A Rehearsal of a No Play on Sado Island. This recalls his experimentation with the Benison Pit. Audiences arrived into the auditorium 30 minutes before stage time to see the actors and technicians working and preparing. Then Prospero would assume rehearsal director, whilst actors remained on stage beyond their scene. Ninagawa had no fixed directorial approach, preferring instead to revisit, reimagine, and revise his own ideas before they became cemented in theory and conviction. His works aren't reality in the optical sense, but how you might remember a dream of reality. Ninagawa directs in a way that calls attention to the work's artificiality throughout, and resonates with associations, aiming at the theatrical rather than a literal presentation of things. This heightened his use of associations, as the theatre allows for metaphors to manifest in ways that the literal cinema does not. The utilizing of artificiality of the theatre, showing the mechanics, the self-awareness of the makers that it is a performance, and made up of actors making a performance. A mishmash of costume styling that constitutes dressing up, or the use of naturalistic acting amongst stylized sets to highlight otherness. Ninagawa uses the theatre as a vehicle for the theatrical. All this is also a trait of modern art, revealing the materials of the art as what it is. The renowned theatre director, Peter Brook, was known for his innovative and influential approaches to staging classical plays. Yukio Ninagawa saw A Midsummer Night's Dream that Peter Brook directed in the 70s in Tokyo, and in the 90s, Ninagawa set his own A Midsummer Night's Dream in a Zen-style rock garden, a playful response to Peter Brook's white box production of the same play. Ninagawa enjoyed aiming to outdo Peter Brook, which he attempted repeatedly. Ultimately, Brook's approach is not about creating a realistic representation of the world, but about creating a theatrical experience that is both authentic and transformative.
I gradually found, just practically, that the human being is richer than the greatest stage effects that exist.
He seeks to awaken the audience's imagination, emotions, and intellect, and to create a sense of connection and community between the actors and the audience. However, Brook's influences are as eclectic as they are contradictory. Whilst on the one hand, Brook rejects literal realism and representation of literal reality, on the other hand, he very much desires a depiction of authentic emotion in the actor. To destabilize things further, he takes inspiration from physical theatre, leading to further abstract physical performance. Yukio Ninagawa's work is a perfect example of how to reconcile these seemingly contradictory influences. His productions demonstrate a masterful blend of abstract symbolic staging with intensely physical and emotional acting. These were symbolic stagings that were not representation of the literal location, and yet the acting was intensely physical and emotional. Ninagawa's use of symbolic sets, costume, and lighting creates an atmosphere that is not bound by literal realism. At the same time, his actors are encouraged to explore the emotional depths of their character, using their bodies and voices to convey the intense emotions and psychological complexity of the play. This approach allows the audience to connect with the play on a deeper level, beyond the surface level of literal representation. The symbolic staging becomes a kind of metaphorical shorthand, evoking the essence of the symbolism rather than trying to recreate a realistic environment. Following his influence from Peter Brook, Yukio Ninagawa had a brilliant ability to visually conceptualize a play by reducing the staging down to its energy of its people and simply the feeling of the place, without decoration, but instead using the presence of the theatre and its mechanics. Ninagawa embraces the artificiality of the theatre. Once it is artificial, he can speak through it. For King Lear, Ninagawa took this minimalism further. The no stage was perfect for an empty space, the real rudimentary stage properties of a no production, but leaned into Peter Brook's empty space. This was also a turning point, as Ninagawa had presented Japanese elements without the spectacle of his earlier plays. He could achieve this through minimalism. Though kabuki elements were still used, Ninagawa could use silence effectively too. No longer were great spectacles a necessity, Ninagawa could use intimate settings. In 1991, Ninagawa directed a British-cast remake of his 1984 Shimizu play in a version by Peter Barnes, renamed Tango at the End of Winter. Produced by Thelma Holt, starring Alan Rickman, presented at Piccadilly Theatre in London. Alan Rickman interrupted a movie opportunity in order to have the opportunity to work with Yukio Ninagawa. A modern Japanese play about a famous actor who abruptly quits the stage and inhabits a world of fantasy and dreams. Rickman apparently captured perfectly the doomed romanticism and narcissism of this falling star. It was a groundbreaking event that a contemporary Japanese play starring British actors and Japanese staff was given a long run in the commercial theatre district of the West End. In 1999, Yukio Ninagawa became artistic director of the Bunkamura Theatre Cocoon in Tokyo. He set up Ninagawa Studio and produced a new series of productions that seem to have taken more influence from his interest in the approaches of Peter Brook. The maximalization of Medea and Macbeth had now been replaced with an essentialism of his staging for Hamlet and Oedipus Rex. Ninagawa wanted to end the century with a tragedy of war, titled The Greeks, a 10-play marathon comprising of work from Homer, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, a performance lasting, including intermissions, for a total of 10.5 hours. A pendulum swings across the stage to represent the time. When John Barton and Kenneth Cavender set out to adapt 9 Greek tragedies, and the Iliad as well, into one long play, the result was The Greeks, which tells the story of 3 families: the House of Atreus, Achilles' family, and the royal house of Troy, over the 17 years surrounding the Trojan War. In 2004, in association with the Bunkamura Theatre Cocoon, Ninagawa produced a revised revival of his 2002 production of Oedipus Rex at the 2nd Century Theatre on the slopes of the Athenian Acropolis, an ancient Roman theatre that stands atop the slope where at the base still sits the remains of an original ancient Greek theatre. Ancient Greek and ancient Roman theatres differ quite drastically. Ancient Roman theatres notoriously have a large and decorative skene, the back wall, that serves as a background. The ancient Greek is more open, originally not having a skene at all, but in all cases is more focused on the circular dancing space for the chorus, with some visibility of the natural landscape behind the stage. This ancient Roman theatre is still used frequently, particularly for the annual Athens and Epidaurus festival. The Greek theatre of Epidaurus is also used for contemporary productions during the festival. This was Ninagawa's 2nd staging and 4th variation of the play after Oedipus Rex 1976 and its 1986 revision, and the 2002 version of which this 2004 production is reviving. but this was the first time that it was performed outside of Japan. A tragedy which he says has very much been at the forefront of his mind since youth. Indeed, he first staged the play in Japan 28 years earlier in 1976. Ninagawa set his 2004 Oedipus Rex in medieval Japan. The set designer Nakagoshi indicates the plague-ridden Thebes by tall black blooms. Ninagawa and Nakagoshi have expressed interest in the German painter Anselm Kiefer, and in his painting The Orders of the Night, 1996, we may see some influence in the black lotus flowers that decorate the set. His Oedipus Rex use a melancholy saxophone as well as intermittent traditional Japanese music, performed by a specialist in ancient Japanese court music, providing the atmosphere with both a sense of outward place and inward feeling. Oedipus was played by Mansai Nomura, a young Kyogen star. His performance was intelligent and commanding, whilst appropriately submissively boyish in his scenes with Jocasta. Jocasta was played by Rei Asami, a leading light of the Japanese stage. In this production, Ninagawa makes use of that Asian multitudinous, with a 20-strong all-male band of Theban citizens providing the play's chorus, still only 20% of his 160-person chorus of the 1976 production. They enter a morning song in all scarlet robes. Whilst during the dialogue scenes, they wonderfully express concern, protectiveness, anger, and horror. One thing Ninagawa doesn't do, which I wish he did, he doesn't make the chorus sing. Their function as a singing chorus is so important to their purpose of even being that, and chanting can't substitute it. But he works with the assembly of crowds so well that he utilizes a chorus on stage in terms of how to move them and position them better than most other directors. Whilst there are many individual differences that make it unlike a Greek tragedy authentically, it's nevertheless a captivating, energetic, and extraordinary executed production. With Oedipus, the energy, strength, and power commanded by Oedipus is far more excellent than the weary Oedipus or frivolous Oedipus desired by so many other directors. This is, after all, a man who believes there is nothing he can't achieve, nothing he can't come to understand. His success against the Sphinx has shown him that. We're quite resistant in the English language to let ourselves be free from the everyday speech of English, but that's the job of poetry. It transcends the everyday language and shouldn't be subservient to it. Dante practically created modern Italian with a few poems. Poetry allows characters to speak as if from mountain peaks, in that they can leap from one great thought to the next and jump to the depths of valleys. But if you're going to have characters speak poetry, then the world they inhabit must not look every day, because such characters wouldn't believably create or live in that everyday world. The environment has to be as stylized as the speech. You have to make it declamatory because it's not conversational material. It's not cinema, so there's no point relying on facial expressions that require close-up shots. It has to be slower than ordinary commonplace behavior because it's declamatory, and they are symbols of status. They have to be authoritative and commanding, but able to be charismatic without sometimes even doing much. But they mustn't seem isolated because they're in a polytheistic world, so they have to feel some connection to the entire outward world. The translator of Ninagawa's Oedipus Rex, Haru Yamagata, expressed that her aim was to communicate the atmosphere of the plays as the Greeks enjoy them today. The Greeks were polytheistic, and arguably Japanese religion remains polytheistic in essence. Haru Yamagata said, "Today, 90% of the Greeks are Christians, so the god of the Greek tragedies tends to be looked at in the context of the Christian god. Of course, they know that the gods of the tragedies are not the Christian god. Even though they know it, it is still hard to get past the image of the Christian god, and I believe that this dilemma is reflected on the stage as well. Contemporary Japan is also a place where faith has weakened, but we still have the customs of praying at times like exams and praying for safe births. So some form of belief in the gods still remains. It's not only a different conception of the universe, but it's a whole different disposition to the world between monotheistic and polytheistic concept of deities, afterworlds, and life." My greatest artistic passion is towards Greek tragedy. I still think it was the greatest idea of an art form ever thought of. There have been more productions of ancient Greek tragedy in the last 70 years than in all the time preceding that, back to the end of antiquity. English-speaking productions of ancient Greek tragedy produced in a non-contemporary stylization by a monotheistic culture comes across most often like a dark and gloomy funeral procession. Yet, like the forgotten colours of the buildings and sculptures of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, the plays were full of energy and colour. I find it impossible to sit through an entire production of one. There are a couple of filmed versions that are okay, because at least in cinema a director can consistently frame a pleasant-looking shot, and the acting can suit for the cinematic or televised format. But in so doing, it takes away from a key aspect of the theatre, of staring relentlessly at both the ugly and the beautiful from any possible angle of the audience, without an ability to edit or pause, but to be relentlessly faced with a situation and stare at its characters unflinchingly without rest. The only stage productions I can bear to watch in full and repeatedly are by Yukio Ninagawa. I don't consider Ninagawa's work to be a fusion or an overlay, nor even a reinterpretation of Western classics. Ninagawa uses Japanese context to emphasize what is already in the material. He uses it to bring the thematic meaning to the forefront of the spectacle. He's less concerned with trying to place a work in a particular time period. The costume design seems more regarding the authenticity of the concerns, actions, and considerations of the characters. They exist in some version of city and society that differs drastically from the modern one. I have no taste for the modern dressing of the classics, as if Oedipus were to discover the origin of his birth casually in the hours after his 9-to-5 job. Neither Shakespeare nor the ancient Greek dramas were writing of characters of their own time. They were both writing of characters of a distant past, so we needn't dress it as the time of the authors, because that's not the time setting of the plays. Ninagawa finds the appropriate stylization to make the language feel authentic, and to make the concerns and decisions of the characters feel appropriate. This whole video could easily slide into a video essay on modernization, so I'll preserve that line of argument for a future video. Also in 2002, Ninagawa was awarded the Order of the British Empire, CBE 3rd Class. And in 2003, Ninagawa directed Sophocles' Electra and Shakespeare's Pericles. Pericles was first performed on the Saitama Arts Theatre stage before being played on the Olivia stage of the National Theatre London, to rave reviews of a British public now entrenched in two wars, Afghanistan and Iraq. This production is widely regarded as another significant milestone in his career and a pivotal moment in bringing Japanese theatre aesthetics to a European audience almost 20 years after the sensation caused by Ninagawa Macbeth in 1985. In 2003, Ninagawa received the prestigious Asahi Performing Arts Award Grand Prix. This award is a testament to the impact and significance of his interpretations of Shakespeare's plays. Heavily influenced by the atom bomb literature movement of the post-war period, Ninagawa enjoyed to direct angry young man plays fighting for their place in society, and was certainly stronger in these themes. Across his career, Yukio Ninagawa directed 8 productions of Hamlet, once declaring that, "With this play, I am answering the question of who I am." But I want to focus on just one. Ninagawa liked to use arresting introductions, framing devices, or acknowledgement of theatrical artifice to explain the rules of a given production. Shakespeare liked to open a play with commotion. Think of the mob opening of Julius Caesar, the brawl of Romeo and Juliet, the shipwreck of the Tempest, for example. Also, imagine the turn of the 16th century London, a crowd of spectators standing in the pit, waiting for a play to start, come rain or shine. Such an opening commands attention. The set was designed by Nakagoshi. Nakagoshi, at the age of 12, has starred as one of the children in Ninagawa's first production of Medea in 1983, and in 8 other productions and revivals. Nakagoshi made his debut as a set designer in 1987, while still at university studying stage art at the age of 21, and would go on to design the stage art for more than 110 stages of Ninagawa's. Ninagawa's process through the production has been described like a jazz session, as Ninagawa feels his way through the rehearsals. This continues his experimental exploration as the production takes shape through the studio process. This means that the visual staging is done during the rehearsal process. Nakagoshi has described his craft as being incomplete until the actors are moving around in that space. Ninagawa tends to look for the central theme of a play and explore that. Not forgetting that Ninagawa originally wanted to become a painter, he articulated to his designers a particular feeling that he wanted from the staging. He would bring sketches he had made, books to reference, and other materials to help convey the visual concept of his direction. But Ninagawa felt that direction and stage art were two separate disciplines, and assumed his own stage art would not be interesting if he designed the stages himself. Whilst Macbeth was defeated by his ambitions, Hamlet is crushed by the burden of his own duty. Like an animal wriggling with desperation for life, giving all its energy to fight for survival. But to what end? To what commitment? To what purpose? But an unfulfilled ambition, desired but not acted on. Such contradictions contort the mind, and it spirals cognitively in disengagement from reality of circumstances into the submerged subjectivity of their own cognitive disposition. Hamlet so sums up this disposition when he remarks, "Denmark is a prison." Naturally, Ninagawa, in collaboration with Nakagoshi, sets the stage as a prison, walled by the audience, which throughout the production conveys the feeling of Hamlet's cognitively imprisoned subjective disposition. Here the metaphor of Denmark is a prison was made manifest. This was a space suffused with shadows, a dark and threatening space, lighting effectively with the theatrical simplicity of blue hues for outdoors and warm amber for inside. The stage style was a traverse stage, a stage that is quite well suited to classical texts with audiences on both sides. The perimeter of the stage was defined by floor-to-ceiling chain-linked fences, and exposed by swaying prison searchlights. Surrounding the fence was an extended stage perimeter, allowing actors to appear outside the main action. On one side of the stage was a large set of doors that opened at key moments. On the other, a trapdoor where the ghost of Elder Hamlet would appear, and actors would appear from the steps between the audience to enter the scenic stage space. The costumes designed by Maeda Fumiko were floor-length robes with more plush velvet for the king and queen. Whilst the metaphor of a prison is a contemporary staging, the costumes are more historical, classical, yet indistinct to a precise time. However, this melting of periods, as well as geographical locations, Denmark, England, Japan, which one might think would be disjointed, is seamless. Ninagawa utilizes the commercial economic strategy of casting high-profile actors, not only for advertising the show, but to allow audiences to understand the characters before the curtain goes up by what they already know of and feel towards the stars' performances. Many of the actors and actresses in Ninagawa's productions are young and energetic. Ninagawa's 2003 production of Hamlet starred Battle Royale's Fujiwara Tetsuya. When he was 14 years old, Fujiwara Tetsuya had already played a pivotal role in Ninagawa's production of Shintokumaru. His performance as the young protagonist Shintoku was widely acclaimed, marking the beginning of his successful acting career. Tetsuya was 14 when he performed in Shintokumaru, 18 when he starred in Battle Royale, and 21 when he played Hamlet in Ninagawa's production. Fujiwara's casting was a bold choice, as he was a relatively unknown actor at the time. His performance, however, showcased his exceptional talent and helped solidify the production's impact. Ninagawa would cast Tetsuya again for the staging of Euripides' Orestes in 2006. On describing his work with young actors, Ninagawa has said, "Basically, the criteria I used for selecting them was whether they could speak their lines well, whether they can move naturally, and the other thing is whether they have what I call lots of noise. I wanted to find young people with untamed animal-like instincts, but most of the actors you see are rather square. They have good posture, they have clear skin, their speech is clean and proper. There is no interest in all of this. There is no noise at all. It is important to be able to deliver your lines with clarity, but clarity without meaning is only annoying. There has to be something inside that possesses the actor and is brought out in words on stage. But there are few actors like that. What I am interested in is having the actors speak to the audience with their acting, without any superfluous theatrics. But I don't know yet how it will work out. It remains to be seen what we can do. Casting Fujiwara utilized his youth through which to see the whole play. Fujiwara's Hamlet was very energetic, railing like an animal in a cage, banging on fences and threw himself against them, as if to try to free his soul from its duty. He was Hamlet with an entrancing tension, stoic but bewildered, manly but fragile. It featured a translation by Kawai Shoichiro, so loved by Ninagawa that he used it for all his subsequent Hamlets. The sound had trumpet licks by Miles Davis when the ghost of Elder Hamlet appeared. The trumpet was the signature sound of the production through a variety of sounds and styled features. The dumb show of the play was if by a Balinese drama, and at the end of the set piece, Ninagawa returned to his slowed performance. Ninagawa saw Hamlet through its broader matters. A country on the brink of war, repeated challenges of leadership, a prince that upends the order of court, and absent fathers. Unlike European versions frequently do, Fortinbras was never excluded from the productions because he represented an important contrast to Hamlet. In the 2003 version, Fortinbras appears from the steps between the audience seats and enters the stage as if in siege of the performance itself, the steps serving as a hanamichi. Ninagawa's adaptations are rich in meaning. The meaning that Ninagawa invests into the given material from relevant Japanese contexts. His choices are not simply for visual styling, but convey meaning. Ninagawa augments the stage. In one way, the actors are where the script places them, and simultaneously they are actors moving around a dressed stage. But he sacrifices neither. They may enter from the stairs between the audience, but the actor is convinced they arrive from extra scenic space. Though his actors are realistic in their emotion, though stylized for the theatre, yet they are unaware of the abstract nature of the setting which they are living their dramas within. The ghost appears, a trapdoor opens, a beam of light appears from its aperture, a trumpet sounds, the actors scatter and freeze, whilst the ghost silently walks across the stage, then leaves through another door of light. There wasn't an attempt for realism, neither is it a suspension of belief. It is an acceptance of the language of the stage, that it speaks in symbols which are not to represent simply the optical reality, but symbols that evoke and convey their meaning. If you can use that artificiality, you can say a lot more than if you try to be real. Theatre speaks bilingual, what it presents and what it means. This meaning is a way of modernizing the plays with depth, rather than modernizing the plays superficially. To modernize is vacuous in and of itself. The only motivation for doing so is to place familiar objects and costumes around the characters, but it's a desire without meaning for those artistic choices. Whilst Macbeth and Medea are his maximalization works, Hamlet and Oedipus are more essentialism. In 2004, Ninagawa cast Fujiwara Tatsuya again in Romeo and Juliet. Ninagawa's visual concept was to surround the stage with yearbook headshots conveying images of funeral photographs of young people that appeared as tombstones to convey a plethora of fictional Romeo and Juliets. Despite its energy, Ninagawa emphasized not the romance, but the inevitable deaths of this scenario by connecting the production with a funeral procession interrupted by the brawl. In a new version of Medea in 2005, the set design was a lotus pond, which was a real pool of water decorated with oversized lotus flowers. This recalls a painting by Kawase. Between 2004 and 2014, Ninagawa produced a series of Roman plays across a decade of work. In 2004, for the set of Titus Andronicus on his visit to Rome, Nakagoshi saw many small figurines of wolves and bought one as a souvenir. Back in Tokyo, this was made as a giant upscaled model for the set, recalling how these particular cast of Romans will tear themselves apart like wolves. Instead of fake blood, Ninagawa took cues from Peter Brook's 1955 version of the same play, where he used red silk ribbons, flowing from Lavina's chopped off arms and mouth, implying her tongue cut out, Her attackers appeared naked with red ribbons covering their genitals, creating discomfort by the contrast of contextual horror encapsulated in an elegant visual choice. The piece of music of Handel, used for Titus Andronicus in 2004, was borrowed directly from the soundtrack of Stanley Kubrick's Barry Lyndon. In 2007, Ninagawa staged Coriolanus, and here he probably found the play most suited to his theatrical interests. He almost returned to themes he was obsessed with in the 1970s. His lived experience of the 1960s protest showed him how violent mobs can be. The play was closer linked globally in the 20th century. The stage set, again by Nakagoshi, involved mirrored walls, Buddhist statues, imparting martial energy, and an enormous set of steps. The steps symbolized the world tree, with the bottom step for the lowest level and the top step for the highest stratum, the divine. Atop the steps, an exchange of vistas reveals Roman or Volscian landscapes. The costumes were pan-Asian, long embellished robes, luxurious for high status. Simplistically, the Romans wore black, the Volscians wore white, whilst the plebs were dressed in thrown-together clothes, suggesting they couldn't afford nicer clothing. Ninagawa placed his actors on the steep stone staircase across which bodies teem and tumble with precision, as if there were hundreds of people on stage. A small boy's almost constant presence on stage reminds us of the insecure masculinity of the boyish Coriolanus. By 2012, Ninagawa had worked in many theatres around the world, but not yet in the Middle East. In 1996, Ninagawa had directed Medea in North Africa for a Palestinian and Egyptian audience. In 2012, Ninagawa staged a radical production of the play The Trojan Women by Euripides in Israel's capital of Tel Aviv on December 29, 2012 to January 5, 2013. Ninagawa here united Japanese and Israeli actors of both Palestinian and Jewish heritage. The play was performed first in Tokyo slightly earlier before its Tel Aviv performance. Not only had Ninagawa already staged The Greeks in 2000, which covered much of the Trojan War, but earlier that same year of 2012, Ninagawa had staged a production of Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida at Saitama Arts Theatre, which is of course set during the Trojan War, so its themes and staging were already ripe within his mind. The play's central themes are the suffering of war, displacement, and the fate of the women after the city has been sacked, their husbands killed, and their remaining families are about to be taken away as slaves or to be married to the enemy. The production was to be performed in 3 languages: Japanese, Hebrew, and Arabic. The performance was initiated by the Israeli dramaturg Vanda Fish in celebration of the 60th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between Japan and Israel. Each performance enjoyed rapturous applause and standing ovation from the audience, who filled the seats every night. The adaptation of The Trojan Women by Jean-Paul Sartre, which he wrote during the Algerian War, had been performed in Israeli theatres several times, but this was the first time that Euripides' original version was staged in Israel. Euripides wrote the play with intense empathy for the suffering. The Greeks come off as being quite horrendous. Euripides is basically perversely subverting the Homeric valor of war by focusing on its inhumanity and the suffering it creates. The Japanese cast played the Greek warriors who had won the war and sacked the city of Troy, whilst Japanese actors played the roles of the Trojan royal family, and the Israeli, Palestinian and Jewish actors playing the roles of the Trojan citizens. A cast of 15 made the chorus in all: 5 Japanese actors, 5 Israeli Jewish actors, 5 Palestinian Israeli actors. Therefore, the Trojans were portrayed as a diverse, multicultural community. This casting choice underscored the idea that the Trojans were a heterogeneous society, much like modern-day cities. Keiko Shuaishi played the role of Hecuba, an Israeli actress played the role of Cassandra, and a Palestinian citizen of Israel played the role of Andromache. In the development of the production, it was decided not to have a binary approach. Instead, he approached the play for the shared humanity of suffering on both sides, by having the Trojans as a multi-ethnic group. Writing in 2024, having the Trojans as Palestinians and the Greeks as Israeli settlers might seem to be more interesting as a theatrical expression. However, not forgetting, Ninagawa was born only 4 years before the Second World War, which Japan lost, and was both heavily bombed and occupied by the United States. Events which had great significance on Ninagawa's youth. Ninagawa said, People who have totally different cultures, each group reaching to the other and understanding each other. That is the power of theatre, and in this world of many differences to talk about hope, that is the role of theatre. To portray the tragedy of war and other issues, we're going to talk through the Trojan Women. Sound designer Masahiro Ono and composer Omitaro Abe took on the honors in this daring, ambitious Israeli-Japanese co-production of the Trojan Women. A choir wails, entreats, mourns, and whispers. Bells, gongs, and crashing percussion intensify the drama as they signal its unfolding, and behind it all, the endless crash of waves upon the shore. The Israeli critics viewed it as an echo of the First and Second World War, and others as an echo of 9/11. Sadly, none made reference to the decades of violence between colonial Israel upon Palestinian territory, and seemed to criticize its very element of multiculturalism. Ninagawa said, "My generation was forced to learn European theatre since youth. Then we thought, if we don't learn the theatre of our own country, we won't be complete. How to blend and unite Japanese identity with what we learned. That was the biggest job as a director. If there's anything relatable to audiences universally, it is extreme emotions, grief, love, desire, etc. It isn't settings and plots or even characters, but the fundamental emotions a work is grown out of. For this to be effective, Ninagawa also needed to tap into public collective memory. But for this to be effective, he also needs to incorporate his own personal memory and reflection. Ninagawa felt memory was integral to his work, his own and Japan's collective memory. Ninagawa continuously developed his thoughts on theatre, searching for an expression of a Japanese theatrical identity. I am still struggling with this disadvantage in our culture, Ninagawa said in 1995. We don't have a definitive self as an agent, an assertive, aggressive self. The core of my artistic struggle is actually to discover such a self. Ninagawa's work is often pigeonholed as about the intercultural dynamics of East meets West. However, despite being an important aspect, I don't think it sufficiently describes Ninagawa's approach to theatre. For one reason, he's always making his work first and foremost for Japanese audiences. Each work was either premiered or developed in Tokyo. Though a non-Japanese audience might be captivated by Ninagawa's work, he deliberately manipulated images from Japanese imagery for a Japanese context. His attraction to the work of either region were their universal themes. Ninagawa wasn't bringing Japanese forms to Western audiences, but rather familiarizing Western drama to Japanese audiences. We could easily describe his work instead as an international style. In fact, he would be known in Japan as Ninagawa of the world. So it's inaccurate to discuss his work as though he was showing the Western countries their own work performed with an exotic lens. What's more, Western 20th century artists were already influenced by Japanese art, and significant Japanese art movements were already long influenced by Western art. There was already a rich and innovative history of international exchange. The idea of a blending of geocardinal cultures doesn't sufficiently explain his artistic choices, and diminishes the involvement of his individual collaborators' contributions. I think the pattern of his work is a continuous leaning towards experimentation, an artistic approach that acknowledges the artificial space of the theatre, a gradual move from maximalism to minimalism, or rather essentialism, but above all, imbuing the stage with meaning. He united two cultural points of view as though his works were bilingual or double-voiced, as two languages that use the same word. This created the mirage vision in the individual imagination. Yet not only fusing, Ninagawa was interested in the differences between Eastern and Western art in all forms. He described Asian theatre as very physically demanding, whilst European was very verbally expressive. Sometimes this was awkward, such as the difficulty of staging race in Othello in a Japanese context, whilst at other times unforgettably disturbing, such as the rape and dismemberment of Lavinia in Titus Andronicus. Nevertheless, the productions of classical Western drama is vital to the study of Ninagawa's career development, and his own obsessions with the theatre. Ninagawa remarked that he intended to make Shakespeare accessible and enjoyable for all people. That, in Japan, Western culture is taught as an advanced superior culture gifting a work to an inferior. His intention was to displace Shakespeare from this impenetrable throne of genius into the ordinary and familiar. Yet, this is not to mean some kind of counter-reformation approach that Catholicism took in biblical and mythical representation. Ninagawa is not making plays more realistic, or better said, more optically recognizable, as an effort towards naturalism. On the contrary, he makes the effort to make it as artificial and subliminal as possible. His marriages of different cultural symbols created a new distinct theatrical world, uniquely situated within the Japanese theatrical landscape. A world filled with manifested associations that referred to the collective ancestral body of his country. Ninagawa revels in the associations that can be derived from aspects of the play, as a way to provide depth. They did not reflect the mundane drab of everyday existence. Ninagawa's theatre was based on triumphant and festive principles. All forms of intertextuality rely on the capacity of the spectator to recognize references and make connections. Ninagawa's allusions to traditional Japanese performance were also reliant on the audience's familiarity with the original forms. His aim was always to enhance his interpretations of foreign or obscure material with imagery drawn from ordinary Japanese lived experience. One might argue that through the plethora of European drama he staged, the quantity of Hamlets, he was discovering Japanese equivalents. Throughout his career, from the earliest productions, Ninagawa was in constant conversation with the traditional arts of theatre. This was his artist's conscience. Despite ever-growing international success and renown, Ninagawa's productions in England have occasionally been unfavourably reviewed after he changed his style from Orientalism set designs of bombastic Japanism productions of Medea and Macbeth to the minimalist King Lear and subsequent Hamlets. But this says far more about English theatre and its critics than about Ninagawa. Since despite its plethora of theatres in London, let alone around the United Kingdom, English theatre remains traditional and old-fashioned in taste compared to theatre foreign to it. Kishi Tetsuo has criticized English critics of his work by saying that they enjoyed his work when they didn't know what they were seeing, escaping into the oriental spectacle. Ninagawa's greatest English champion after Thelma Holt was Michael Billington, yet in other areas around English regions, the productions were received favourably. In his retirement retrospect, Michael Billington put Ninagawa's 1985 Macbeth as one of his top performances that he saw across his long career as a theatre critic. Ninagawa said of the reception of his work in Japan, "I have been considered an enfant terrible of Japanese theatre because it doesn't look like European theatre. There is a lot of traditional Japanese theatre. Brecht, Stanislavski, that's not what I did, so I was not liked." Gradually, the Japanese assessment changed. As well as Shakespeare and the Greek dramas, Ninagawa staged work of many other Western writers. Of course, this video has been negligent of the enormous success he had staging Japanese work. Ninagawa collaborated with scripts from numerous Japanese writers, not only the modern no plays of Yukio Mishima, but also the historical plays of Matsuo Akamoto, and also modern and contemporary writers. Yet Ninagawa's longest-running writing collaborator was Kunio Shimizu, of which he staged 13 different plays across 36 productions. One might compare this with that Ninagawa staged 13 different ancient Greek dramas by 3 separate dramatists. Yukio Ninagawa directed over 171 individual projects. Ninagawa's directing works are diverse, and outside of the field of contemporary theatre, in 1992, Ninagawa has directed a Wagner opera, The Flying Dutchman, and he directed several films, TV dramas, concerts, and even fashion shows. In 2006, he founded a new theatrical company called the Saitama Gold Theatre for people over 55 years old, which is based at Saitama Arts Theatre. Of the theatre, Ninagawa said, "Old age is a proof that you experience deep emotions and many days of ordinary lives. Physical expression using this personal history might help one to discover one's new perspective." The Saitama Gold Theatre performed Kunio Shimizu's Ravens We Shall Load Bullets in 2013 in Paris, a play that was originally written in the 1970s. In 2009, Ninagawa started the Saitama Next Theatre, as a training project to nurture the next generation of young Japanese actors, with the average age around 25 years old. In 1998, Yukio Ninagawa announced his Seinokuni Shakespeare series, a long-term aspiration to stage all 37 of Shakespeare's plays at the Saitama Arts Theatre in Saitama City, Ninagawa's hometown, literally bringing the success of his career home. The first production was the play that began Ninagawa's own exploration into Shakespeare's works, Romeo and Juliet, on January 21st, 1998. In spring of 2016, Ninagawa was rehearsing for the upcoming June production of the Seinokuni Shakespeare series Measure for Measure. Tragically, during the rehearsals of Ninagawa's production for Measure, Yukio Ninagawa passed away at the hospital in Tokyo at 1:25 p.m. on Thursday, May 12, 2016, at the age of 80, due to multiple organ failure caused by pneumonia. The production of Measure for Measure was to be shown in Ninagawa's hometown of Saitama 13 days later, on May 25, 2016. In Shakespeare's Measure for Measure, the Duke decides to temporarily leave the city and appoints a deputy, Angelo, to govern in his place. Measure for Measure is considered neither a tragedy nor a comedy, but leaves us debating and exploring the ideas it leaves for its audiences. On June 10, 2016, the Japanese government decided at a cabinet meeting to award Ninagawa the junior third rank, effective May 12, the day of his death, in recognition of his contributions to the development of theatrical culture. In July 2016, Ninagawa Company was established by his family to manage the records of Ninagawa's work. Between 1983 and 2019, there was no single calendar year that didn't see a Ninagawa production performed outside of Japan, a record disrupted only by the 2020 coronavirus pandemic. This ambitious Seinokuni Shakespeare series project of Ninagawa's was officially completed 5 years after his death by Kotaro Yoshida on May 12, 2021, with the production of All's Well that Ends Well.